So welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and this is a map we haven't seen in quite a while. This is the front of the Black Gate. I'm not really sure whether to classify this one as a siege or not. It's certainly a battle which once again actually is on the shorter side of things. We've had a couple of those of late, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's a nice break, to be honest, from all of the extremely long siege battles that we have seen. This is going to be a themed battle as well, with I think 3 Mordor armies alongside their Easterling allies facing off against various forces of good, albeit this is a battle where the forces of good have a chance at winning conventionally, unlike in Return of the King. But yeah, it's going to be an interesting one. I mean, it is largely a flat and even affair, more pitch battle-less. There are a few fortifications, but other than that, it's mostly going to be... I would assume that the red team here are going to have the slight impetus to be the offender here, considering that the Black Gate is technically being defended by armies that have sallied out from it. But aside from that, it's a very simple map to explain, really. There's no great detail to be gone into. This is another one sent to me by Winged Swordsman 44, but more on that at a later time. We shall start off with Fried Rice, who is playing as Imladris, adding a little bit of quality to the attackers here today. Gwaith the Arthedain, very heavy spear unit, which of course we have seen several times before. One of the toughest infantry units to kill in the game. They themselves, though, do lack a little bit in terms of their offensive capabilities, especially in comparison to many of the other Imladris units in particular. They are subject to the spear malice after all, and their attack values do suffer a little bit in comparison to many of their elven counterparts here, but that's never really been their priority in life anyway. They've been mostly a defensive bulwark, and they are very, very good at that. A nice anchor to the line as well are the Imladris sentries. In the world of pikes, they are pretty damaging. They're better at dealing damage than most pikes, as you would expect, considering they are one of the more expensive units of pikemen that the game has to offer. But they're also very expensive. And one of the things that you tend to want to do with your pikes is blanket your line with them so that you can anchor more than just a thin strip of your front line with them. However, that's a little bit more difficult for Imladris to do, because if you invest a lot into your pikes, your army is tending to be rather small. As you can see here from Imladris' army, it's certainly not a big army by any means, and that's because Fried Rice has definitely gone very quality heavy, which may pay off, or it may not, considering that Mordor should be able to envelop them fairly easily as a result of this. Gwaith the Mirkwood, however, are the other bodyguard unit that Imladris can bring on foot, and they are going to be very well suited for facing off against Mordor. Armour upgrade as well is going to make them that little bit more resilient to the damage they're inevitably going to take. But that armour piercing is going to be very, very good against Mordor. Most of Mordor's defensive prowess comes from their armour values, however limited it may be for their lower tier units, or however significant it may be for their higher tier units. These Warhammers are going to be able to crack right on through that crude orcish plate. And the Gwaith the Mirkwood themselves are also a little bit better on melee defense than many other armour-piercing bodyguard units as a result of their elven heritage. Eldarenwe Spearmen, kind of similar to the Gwaith the Arthedain that we've already seen, only they are not a bodyguard tier unit. They don't have that second hit point to set them apart. But you can have more than one, and I do believe they have got another one in the backfield somewhere. Eldarenwe Spearmen, though, very, very effective as a frontline combatant in terms of staying alive. There are better Imladris units for dealing damage, but that's always going to be the case comparing spears to swords. Speaking of which, Eldarenwe Swordmasters here are pretty much the opposite end of the spectrum. They are very, very strong in melee at dealing damage. Their melee defense is also high enough to the point where in sustained melee combat they're going to be very difficult to bring down, but their lack of a shield does make them a little bit more vulnerable to missile units of varying types, and that's going to be one way in which Mordor will be hoping to do a bit of damage here to Imladris. Imladris will be doing some damage of their own from afar though. Norreturno warriors. Again, Imladris do lack a little bit in terms of their archers compared to the other elven factions, but then those other elven factions are very strong at long range. Imladris still have plenty to offer. Norreturno warriors, for example, decent medium archers, but they also are pretty strong in melee. For a heavier archer, they have the Eldarenwe archers as well, which of course are going to be able to take more of a beating at range and also be more useful when their ammunition is expended, even if the Norreturno warriors' main selling point is their increased abilities in melee. The Eldarenwe archers are much, much more expensive, so they are better still. Imladris sentries, another unit of them, another unit of the Eldarenwe spearmen, and a couple of cavalry units as well. Norreturno cavalry, which this is a very seldom seen unit indeed. We've mentioned somewhat recently that single HP cavalry leaves a little bit to be desired for the most part, but Norotino cavalry, and Norotino cavalry certainly counts itself among this number, but it is interesting to see them nonetheless. They even have their armour upgrade, which is the sort of thing you don't see all that often, to be fair, but they can get decent charges off, but I don't know whether they'll be offered the ability to do so by Mordor, given the fact that Mordor can surely cover the field more easily than Imladris. Then we have Tintin, 2208, playing as Lothlorien, so another elven faction here. Riders of the Golden Wood, another cavalry unit, but this, a multiple HP bodyguard tier cavalry unit, which is how this version of the game is certainly won or lost on horseback, and Riders of the Golden Wood, fantastic in melee, but the main feature of them is of course the fact that they fire Silverthorn arrows from horseback, making any sort of advance towards them difficult, very damaging at the base as well. They've gone for some Lorenaund Axemen on the front, which are going to be very good against Mordor and pretty good against the Eastlings as well to boot. They don't have quite the same defensive capabilities as the Imladris elves we've already seen, but they do have a bit of extra damage thanks to those axes. Lorenaund Spearmen are not quite as good as the Eldarenway Spearmen from Imladris, but those Eldarenway are extremely expensive. The Lorenaund Spears are more in line with what you would expect from a standard heavier elven unit, which is still expensive, but not quite as extreme as the Imladris offering. And they do make for a very tanky front line as well. But again, Lothlorien by their very nature are going to be a smaller army, so we'll see how this goes. Lorenaund Warriors, armour piercing we've already mentioned briefly with the Gwaith Mirkwood. The armour piercing is going to be very useful against Mordor in particular, less so against the Easterlings by comparison, but it's still not going to be useless there by any means. So it's not too surprising to see the Lorenaund Warriors here, given that Lothlorien can field this standard unit of AP shock infantry more easily than the other elven factions. More axemen. Lorenaund Swordmasters following the same principle as the spears, not quite as strong as the equivalent Eldarenway from Imladris, but they are a little bit more affordable, and they will do largely the same job against this kind of opposition. And then we have the Watchers of the Golden Wood and the Kindred of Celeborn at the back. Not too rare in this version of the game to see both of the archer bodyguard units that Lothlorien have at their disposal on the field. The Silverthorns from the Watchers of the Golden Wood and the single two-handed sword, and then the split shot projectiles and the two single-handed swords that the Kindred of Celeborn wield, and some Lorenaund archers as well to offer more pressure. So definitely a heavier look to this Lorien army. There could be a couple of hidden units here and there, but it's unlikely given the kind of money that it takes to field an army like that. But they are going to be 2v1 against Mordor and Rhun there in the middle. Meanwhile, over here, where Winged Swordsman 44 is concerned, hemmed in as he is going to be 2v1 against the elves here from Mirkwood, and over there Arthedain, Y2K and Mark playing as them. Hiriak, heavy elven spearmen, more similar to the Lorenaund ones than the Imladris ones. Hiri Peng. Mirkwood are fairly close to Lothlorien really, only they have a little less armour piercing, a little bit more focused on melee defence, and they have a few more options when it comes to their lighter units. They've got a few more specialty units like the Greenwood Assassins. Blades of Emondwyr are just a standard unit of lighter elven infantry, sword and board. We've got some Huntsmen of Amon-Lank, again, more single HP cavalry here. Not too rare to see the bows of Emondwyr, because horse archers do have their place, even if it is niche, especially on a more open map like this. But the Huntsmen can be very effective in melee against other similar cavalry when they appear, but the lack of a shield and the lower armour values of Mirkwood, I should say, in general, are going to make their use a little bit more tricky. The Ents are on the field. I mean, they can certainly do a lot of damage very quickly. Elven King's Palace Guard, we've seen how brutal they can be. Ever the fan favourite and ever the multifaceted unit that they are. Wooden Realm Patrol already getting ready to shoot into the Mordor position. And the Hiri out as well. I don't think there's going to be a grace period, which is rather unfortunate for Winged Swordsman, because he's not set up his army in a battle-ready formation whatsoever, so we'll see how this goes for him. The Wardens of the North are already in range as well, given the fact that those armour-piercing projectiles are trained onto whatever unit they can see, really, in that Mordor army. It's going to be fairly painful, especially given the Arthedain marksmen are also here to help blanket the Mordor position in a hailstorm of arrows. Standard Evendim Spearmen, Arthedain, of course, in comparison to the elves that we've already seen, are going to be far more reliant on their strong armour, that sort of well-rounded backbone that most of the Western Kingdoms of men tend to be reliant upon. But Evendim Spearmen, technically speaking, are a militia spear unit in spite of their full plate, but I've made my feelings about that clear in the past. Arthedain Men-at-Arms, meanwhile, a standard mid-tier unit of sword and board infantry from the human kingdoms. they'll do a fine job. I mean, considering it's mainly orcs they're going up against, especially with that armor upgrade, they should trade fairly favourably with a fair number of Mordor's units. It's going to be the Dunedain Peacekeepers that really set themselves apart, though. They should be very effective against the entry-level Mordor units and a fair number of the Easterlings as well, should they still be alive when that particular fight is getting underway. Arthedain pikemen offer some more polearms, which, to be fair, we haven't seen any other pikemen since the Imladris army, so they may very well be coming in useful. Breastplate as well equipped. More Ebondim spearmen here at the back, guarding the rear lines, and then over here, Dunedain Mounted Company, yet more single HP cavalry, which is, again, a bit of a rarity, like I said. Melee cavalry as well, so they're interested in keeping Mordor hemmed in and preventing easy use of their own cavalry, but we'll see how that goes. I mean, we'll get on to Winged Swordsman's army right away. He does have cavalry. However, the Dunedain Mounted Company will struggle, not so much against the Arthedain Lancers, because they're more of an aggressive cavalry unit. Single HP they may be, but they at least have the shields and the armour to be a little bit resilient if they can be used as shock cavalry should be, which is charged in and out. But Melkor's Chosen will make very light work of the Dunedain Mounted Company, again as a result of that second hit point they have and the extreme advantage in stats that these Caragor riders can rely upon. Orc fodder to help pad out the numbers, as well as Morannon infantry, a very workmanlike front line this will make. And this is the sort of force which much of the quality that the elves have and stuff like the standard Arthedain pikes and men-at-arms will be pretty good against as well, but numbers will come into things as well. Manoeuvring is going to be key, but Winged Swordsman is going to have to be very quick on the draw here to reorganise his army better than this. Blackguard of Barad-dûr, more useful in sieges. I mean, in the upcoming patch, as I've already mentioned, Great Shield Infantry has been improved a little bit in melee to make them more useful than just as a bludgeon, but here I don't know how much use they're going to see. They can disrupt formations and maybe be effective against the elves, but the more immediate problem are going to be the kingdoms of men in Arthedain. Minas Morgul Chosen offers a little bit of rigidity to the front line as well. Same principle as any heavy spear unit, though. They're going to suffer a little bit in terms of their ability to deal damage. Olag High may be called upon to throw themselves under the bus a little bit to disrupt this firing line that the enemy have set up. Bodyguard tier units here with the Temple Executioners, the Nazgul and the Temple Guard. So some armor-piercing arrows could be utilised in response here. The upgraded Executioners and the Nazgul will be hoping that they don't come under too much close attention from those Wardens of the North and any of the Elven archers that are in range. More cavalry from Adin Men, who's playing as the one runic army on the defence. Dragon's Wrath Warlords and Cummel's Dragon Knights. This is the sort of thing which is very common in this version of the game, going for both multiple HP cavalry units and for good reason. Again, they should have the advantage here in terms of their mounted divisions based on the Melkor's Chosen and both of these two units. Even if the Warlords lack an anti-cavalry bonus, they're still significantly stronger as a result of that HP bonus. And the Dragon Knights, of course, have got everything you would want. Very nasty charge, very strong armour, and that second hit point, like I say. Gamp Rim in behind. If Rhun are known for one thing, it's armour piercing. Maybe less useful, actually, against Lothlorien and Mirkwood here in the middle, but it will help, at the very least, make Rhun a better fight for Imladris, and it will certainly be very useful against Arthedain, just as the Alok Flag Rim will be. Solid front line indeed with the armor-piercing attacks. The Scion Rim represent a tough unit, very similar to the Morgul Chosen we've already seen. A spear unit which packs on mostly defensive attributes more so than anything offensive. And then in behind we've got some Eastron crossbows. Crossbows, of course, could be very effective, even against the elves, as long as they can get into range first without getting massacred at long range by all of the archers that the elves and, of course, Arthedain can bring. Balkoth Tribesmen, similar sort of situation with them, and, of course, the Dragon's Wrath crossbows with their body piercing. So, lots of power bound up in closer range projectiles here, but whether they'll be able to utilise them effectively remains to be seen. Moving on to Her Tumihai, playing as another Mordor army. He's got the Temple Executioners as well, but he's punted for more Morannon Halberds. He's in a better position to set up a Phalanx front line anyway, and given Lothlorien and Mirkwood don't have any Phalanx units of their own on the field today, the Halberdiers could be just the thing for helping them withstand an Elven advance. I mean, this is a very long front line as well, and it's several ranks deep, so that is maybe not the worst idea. Some Morannon infantry mixed in there as well, but I would suggest that Lothlorien are going to try and soften it up with arrow fire first and foremost, so I'll be interested to see how Mordor react to that. Orc Javelins in behind when the advance begins. We've already seen Olag High, Orc Fodder ready to reinforce the line with numbers should the need arise. Standard Orc archers are of course going to be absolutely no match for the kind of Elven archers that are going to be on the field today, but they will make it a little bit more difficult for the elves to use their ammunition efficiently. And there's also some Temple Guard over there as well, which they of course are a threat to the elves. Any armor piercing arrow unit is going to be pretty nasty. And then last but not least, another Mordor army under the command of Pontaman. He has got some Olag High and some standard Temple Executioners without the armor upgrade here on the flank. They do have an opportunity here, to be fair, on this flank to maybe move forward and try and take advantage of the fact that that is a very small Imladris army indeed. The quality may be scary, but the numbers certainly aren't. Rhun on infantry mixed in with Minas Morgul's Chosen. Again, another workman-like front line. Though nothing really in terms of any phalanx units, it does make them a little bit more manoeuvrable on the battlefield, which will make taking an aggressive stance a little bit easier, should they choose to do so. Nazgul, Orc Javelins and Temple Guard back here as well, so the Nazgul can be surrounded by some lower end units should they be required to in front of them, and then backed up by Javelins and armor-piercing arrows as well. Then on the flank, that Norotino cavalry is in for a pretty rough time of it if the Melkor's Chosen and Arthedain Lancers both have anything to do with it. Again, the Lancers may very well be a shock cavalry unit just like them, but they're significantly tougher than the Noratinos. And then way out here on the flank, we do have some Arthedain Shadowbows. Rangers on a wide open map like this, they're not going to be as devastating in a siege by far, but if a front line really gets underway, especially seeing as Imladris' army is quite small, a few volleys is all it will take, I think, to give Mordor a bit of an edge. But it is worth saying this isn't the largest Mordor army in the world either. I think they have maybe gone a little bit too quality heavy to be able to swamp forward and really take advantage of how small Imladris are, and you're never going to win a quality war against Imladris, so that is fairly surprising. You're not going to win a quality war against the elves in general, even with some of the scary stuff that Mordor has at the high end, so I'm not sure. Based on compositions and where the armies are set up, I actually fancy the attackers' chances in this 4v4 far more so than the defenders, but we'll get over here because these first volleys are going to be the key here. I don't think there's going to be a grace period considering DF Mark and Y2K are already starting to fire, but we'll see. Let's get this show on the road, shall we? So I think we'll get to see the shape which this battle will take fairly early here, because if Mordor, under the command of winged swordsmen, do get 2v1 over in this cut-off section of the map, which it does look as though he is going to have to contend with as the arrows start flying in. The trolls are an interesting first choice of target though. But that does mean the actual battle in front of the gate itself will initially have the advantage will initially go to the forces of evil trying to defend it, but we'll have to wait and see. I do think that isolating individual pockets of the Mordor army and not allowing them to form up a full force with all of the numbers that entails could prove to be a very powerful thing indeed, especially when we consider that Mordor weren't really ready for this attack. The Arthedain Lancers, they do manage to connect with that charge actually, but only with the side of the unit. That could have been far more devastating than it ended up being, which is kind of fortunate for Mirkwood, but Mordor did well just to be able to utilise their cavalry in some respects, and already I think we're going to have to go down to half speed because there's stuff happening all across the battle that we're going to have to go and take a look at as well. But Melkor's Chosen are going to easily be able to chase off the bows of Emondwyr, but you can see the main problem Mordor are going to have to deal with here is that they are bottled up, and the forces of Arthedain and Mirkwood, their infantry, will be able to pin Mordor in place really no matter what Mordor decides to try and do. And when you're pinned in place and the damage that's coming at you is from Arthedain and especially Mirkwood's archers, it is going to be painful for you no matter how many numbers or how much armour your units are packing on. That sort of thing, when you have it at your disposal, can help mitigate the damage that this sort of approach can inflict upon you, but it's going to be tough on Mordor regardless, and Dunedain Peacekeepers and many of the Elven units trade quite favourably with many of the Mordor forces. But as we see over here, this is the trade-off for this. We can see that Lothlorien are largely alone, and Tintin is going to be able to get in behind enemy lines with his cavalry. Well, Tintin is having cavalry behind his lines, adding men using his Dragon's Wrath Warlords and Dragon Knights, and this is going to be painful. Lothlorien don't have the numbers to be able to withstand this sort of pressure, and I think this is going to be even more of a stark contrast than what we're seeing over, aside from the gate where Mordor are the ones being overwhelmed, purely because Mordor have got the numbers to the point where they can at least look as though they're trading evenly with their opponent for a little while, whereas Lothlorien, they just don't have the numbers to be able to cover all the angles that Mordor and Rhun as well are going to be able to come at them with. And I'm a little bit surprised actually that Rhun are not hustling a little bit more. I mean, their cavalry is doing the business certainly in Lothlorien's backlines, but aside from that, it is actually just a straight up even fight between Mordor and Lorien, and that does take away a little bit from the advantage that maybe they could bring to bear against the elves. After all, Mordor are only going to last so long in the situation that they're in. You would assume the same is true of Lothlorien, so it's just a case of which of these two outnumbered forces can get the more efficient engagements. And then as a result of that, will the reinforcements make a big difference? Meanwhile, the Imladris force, which is over here, really the only dead-even engagement that we have from the start of the battle. The other Mordor force from Pontaman on the flank against Friedrice's Imladris army. As we mentioned in the composition, the Imladris army is incredibly quality focused, which may prove to be a little bit of a problem. I mean, the cavalry over here, the cavalry advantage is definitely in favour of Mordor, considering the Norretirno cavalry is what Imladris have brought, and Mordor have got all of their heavy hitters. The Melkors chosen in particular are the main issue here, and you can see that Mordor are already doing a pretty good job actually of getting in behind enemy lines, and this is what Imladris do not need at all. When you go for a very quality heavy army, you can't afford large, big spikes of damage being delivered, and that's exactly what Lance Cavalry is capable of doing. Even the single HP Lance Cavalry that the game traffics in this version of it, it's still going to be effective in this sort of situation, and you can see that the Imladris front line is holding for now, but much more of that and they're going to be in real trouble. The gaps that are appearing in the line, however, immediately are being taken advantage of by the god Helym, so it's not all doom and gloom for Imladris over here, but I would still give the edge based on how the engagement is going and based on the fact that the cavalry is running roughshod all over Imladris' quality units. I would still give the edge certainly to Mordor over here, and that could cause a cascading effect down the battlefield. And that, I believe, is the Imladris general that just got trampled by the Arthedain Lancers. The last thing Lothlorien need, after all, is yet more Mordor orcs making their way over here to the middle. For the time being, though, the fact that Rhun are dragging their feet a little bit is giving the elves the impetus they need to really start butchering their way through all of the basic Mordor orcs. So, as much as it is a tough situation for Lorien, not too dissimilar to what Imladris is facing, Lorien do seem to be withstanding this sort of thing better. The Dragon Knights have been consistently charging in and out of the archer lines in the back, but the durability of the bodyguard archers that Lothlorien have has made them a harsher target than most for the Dragon Knights, and the Dragon Knights are also not doing so well in pure melee terms against the Kindred now. But so far it is the cavalry which is making the difference here for the de facto defenders, able to get in behind enemy lines and do a lot of damage. The Olag High, individually, the elves would actually do better against trolls than most, but the Olag High here part of a general advance with many Morannon Uruks in behind them and also Temple Executioners. So here are where Mordor are significantly stronger and Lorien getting overwhelmed by numbers and quality. And much more of this sort of thing, and Lorien will be starting to go the way of Imladris, where they simply won't be able to withstand the kind of damage coming at them. Orc Javelins on the flanks as well, Hertuna High getting in some good positions. So far the defenders, I would say, are in a pretty good place, other than Winged Swordsman himself, who is being forced back, which is completely unsurprising, caught up against the cliffs as he was, and Arthedain and Mirkwood bringing their full might to bear. The best, really, that Winged Swordsman can hope to do is simply tie up the Arthedain and Mirkwood armies for as long as he can and do as much damage as he can. Although I have to say, it does look as though the forces of good over here have been pretty clinical with how they've dispatched much of Winged Swordsman's army. That range support coming in and then the large-scale infantry push has been very, very successful. But this is the sort of thing which the attackers will need, as we've already seen in other parts of the battlefield. The defenders very much in the ascendancy, so the fact that they will probably have to deal with a fairly decent-sized Arthedain and Mirkwood host later on gives the attackers that hope that they will need going into the late game. In combination with all of the other cavalry units that they have, the Dunedain Mounted Company, again, much more of a lightweight look to the cavalry force of the attackers here, but difficult for the Melkors chosen to really break free based on how bottled up this force was. The Elven King's Palace Guard right into the back lines as well, and under normal circumstances the Temple Guard very, very capable of taking care of a unit that closes them down in melee, but this is a bit of a different situation. The Palace Guard, one of the finest units of damaging infantry the game has to offer. And that's pretty much it from Winged Swordsman, actually. We came just in time to see his final demise. There's a few bodyguard tier units clinging on for dear life, but they're surely not going to last too much longer, although they do seem to be content to just allow this unit of Temple Executioners to live, based on the fact that I think Arthedain are trying to maybe rush over to the aid of their elven allies in the centre, which Mirkwood have already got a bit of a head start on, so Arthedain don't need to rush too much, I don't think, because I don't think, regardless of whether Arthedain get there or not, I mean, you can see that Lothlorien do appear to have collapsed, so once again we're here just in time to see the demise of one force as Mordor continues to move forward. And you have to say that Rhun have kept themselves largely in reserve. They've committed their cavalry, of course, and a few of their units have trickled their way to the front line, but for the most part they're looking pretty healthy, and that will allow them to put on a strong front against the inevitable, firstly Mirkwood and then Arthedain armies that are going to be heading their way. The Scion Rim further forward, Huntsman of Amon Lank. What is going on over here then? Again, a similar story as what is befalling Lothlorien, as you kind of expected with Imladris. They're actually clinging on quite well, Imladris, considering they started to falter, I think, before Lothlorien. They're in a largely similar state at this point, where they've got a few scattered units. The pikes probably did help on the front line in the fact that Imladris just have that greater survivability in general, but it was an interesting army from Fried Rice in the sense that if it starts to go wrong with big damage coming at you, things can unravel fairly quickly. But I mean, it's not beyond the realms of possibility, I suppose, that Imladris could really make Pontaman's Mordor army pay quite dearly here, which going to be a Pyrrhic victory perhaps for Mordor. That would be my guess, and there's still cavalry influence on this fight, which, considering how depleted both armies now are, even 4 Melkor's Chosen are enough to tip the balance of a melee fight fairly significantly. Imladris Sentry's defeat seems certain for them, as the Olag High come charging in. I mean, the God Helene, with 28 of them, and the fact the Olag High have already seen battle, maybe the God Helene can overcome them. The Trolls too may be getting a little bit of a mechanical overhaul in the next patch, as I've heard. Not too significant, of course. They'll largely work the same way, but this mechanical change, which I'll hold off on talking about for the moment because it may or may not happen, will make them a little bit more effective at dealing damage in the time that they are alive, but they will still have all the same weaknesses to being overrun in melee quickly by high damage infantry if you're not careful. Dragon Knights over here, being warded off now by the Dunedain mounted company. So, I mean, Winged Swordsman is still alive over here, which I think is a little bit of an oversight. I don't think... Well, there goes Winged Swordsman's general. Nazgul are on the way over, as well as the Temple Executioners, so it is the very best of Mordor's units that still live. I think the Temple Guard are almost completely gone. Whether the Nazgul and the Temple Executioners will be enough to bring down the Palace Guard, as they are backed up by a few Woodland Realm Axemen, we shall have to wait and see. Based on the damage already inflicted on the Temple Executioners, I'd still back the Palace Guard, but the Nazgul do muddy the waters somewhat. It's very hard to tell what sort of state the Nazgul are in because of how many hit points they usually have. It's a fair assumption to assume that they're always in a pretty good place to be taking damage. Arthedain marksmen getting up onto the high ground, starting to shoot down into the ranks of the defenders, as the Orc Archers are going to be chased off. By the looks of things, Lothlorien are completely gone, as her High is now able to move over. So I think the initial plan for Mirkwood moving themselves over here fairly quickly was to try and reinforce Lothlorien, but they collapsed pretty quickly, Lothlorien, when the damage started heading their way, so it's not terribly surprising that. Meanwhile, Kindred of Celeborn came over here, so it's interesting interplay here between the attackers as they try to do as much damage as they possibly can now to try and give the Arthedain Mirkwood axis as good a chance as possible of being victorious in this fight. Imladris finally being brought down. There's still Uruk captains in here, there's still Temple Guard, so Pontaman does have some high tier units of his own, but it is worth saying that his army is in significantly worse shape than her High was in the middle, but then Pontaman also did not have the benefit of getting a little bit of support from runic archers and cavalry. So there we have it. Pontaman can move over here, but the stronger the defender's position is allowed to get now by the attackers, the worse it will probably end up being for them in the long run. And the Kindred, I mean, they trying to bring down the Melkor's Chosen. There's only 4 of them, but in all fairness, based on the treatment that especially Lothlorien and Imladris have received in this battle, I can definitely see why they would see the cavalry as still a very large threat, and perhaps revenge is foremost in their mind. These Kindred taking hits from the Orc Archers, but the Orc Archers low quality archers, so the kills are coming at a relatively slow pace. Lots of damage being dished out. Getting last samurai'd a little bit here, the Melkor's Chosen. Only 1 manages to make it to the lines, but we've already seen the Kindred of Caliborn do quite well against the Dragon Knights in a melee fight. Won't matter too much, of course, with Temple Executioners also on the way. This will be the end of the Kindred of Caliborn, but at least they will go down being useful. As the rest of that Mordor army, or what's left of it at the very least, starts to make its way forwards. As we make our way over here, are we going to start to see... Well, for the time being, it is just trading back and forth with archers, mostly actually the attackers having the better of this particular skirmish fight. The Orc Archers struggling a little bit to do their thing. Scion Rim turning their back, so the shields now not coming into effect. So that will be very useful for them. Attackers to bring down more of those heavy spears. And then over yonder still, Haldir surely will be perishing fairly soon. In a straight up fight I would back the Temple Executioners in melee at the best of times, let alone with a slight numbers advantage, considering all the damage those Orc Archers have inflicted as well. That is definitely something worth taking into account. I think now the engagement will become a little bit more singular, so we'll go back up to regular speed. As the rest of Pontaman's army moves forward again. Just having Uruk captains is a nice thing to have in the late game as well, that armour piercing. There is those Nazgul as well. I mean, having a look at this little fight that's still going on over here, you can see, well, actually Mordor are going to be victorious in this one, only just, but you'd still say that Winged Swordsman certainly lost this fight, but one last spit in the eye to his assailants, who 2v1'd him. He will be able to bring down the Palace Guard, which could have been such an important unit. Of course, Dunedain Mounted Company. I'm surprised actually some cavalry wasn't over here to try and secure that victory, to be honest with you. A little bit of an oversight by the de facto attackers, but it is what it is. So staring off against one another after a fairly fast and frenetic, there goes one of the Dunedain as well as Thranduil. Like I was saying, after a fairly fast and frenetic opening phase where 3 very distinct engagements were taking place, we will now distill it down into just the one as they stare off against one another, running parallel to the Black Gate now, though rather fittingly the front of the back Black Gate is still occupied by the defenders. I mean, in terms of ranged skirmishing, I would assume that both sides have got a slightly lighter ammunition supply now, but whoever has the best ammunition supply should be using to leverage that to try and utilise it to force the enemy into moving. It is interesting that this is going on though. I mean, you can definitely tell that the defending mindset is now first and foremost in the Mordor Runic Alliance's mind, purely due to the stance that they appear to be taking up now. Going to be trying to centre their defence around slightly heightened terrain, utilising a few of the fortifications to their advantage. Temple Guard still rolling forth as well. Pontaman will be able to join his allies without any issues. Mirkwood and Arthedain don't appear to be too keen on the on moving forward, but again, if it is an attack-defence kind of situation, it is, the onus is on the attackers really to move forward, and they did have an opportunity to be a little bit more quick and aggressive before Rhun and Mordor decided on this course of action. So again, my sympathy is not non-existent, but very limited, if this is indeed how things will be going down. Plenty of halberds here, which is a little bit worrying. Mirkwood, of course, in a straight-up melee engagement can be bullied a little bit by polearms, but having a look at the Arthedain force, how many pikes have they got left? Because that may well prove to be a bit of a difference maker. They do have a fair number, not limitless, but they won't be bullied by the halberdiers as much as maybe they were fearing. That armour piercing on the Mordor force, though, could also end up being exceptionally useful against the surviving Arthedainians. So what's going on here then? Well, Mordor are actually moving forward. Rhun posting up on this hill, but Mordor look as though they aren't going to simply hang around and wait. They will take the fight to the enemy, which is very fitting for them, of course. When I say that, they're going to move forwards ever so slightly. Again, this isn't really the kind of battle where I feel the need to make too much of a cut, because as soon as the battle gets underway, I imagine it's going to be, again, another fast and brutal affair, which goes about its business pretty quickly. Dragon's Wrath crossbowmen are over there. They are isolated. I don't know what they're really doing over here. Very strange manner in which Rhun have decided to approach this particular battle. Huntsmen of Amon Lank are coming over here to introduce themselves. There's not enough of them to demolish the unit completely, and indeed the Huntsmen will probably end up perishing in melee with the Dragon's Wrath crossbowmen pretty quickly. A few of the Dragon's Wrath crossbowmen do fall as a result of that charge, but it's certainly nothing too devastating now, is it? As they start trotting away, but coming back as well. I mean, there's nothing really that the Huntsmen of Amon Lank can do other than this that would be useful, so I can certainly see why this is the course of action being taken. I would still give the edge to the defenders going into the latter stages of this one, I must say. Ents are still alive. Ents also well, I say completely unbloodied, some of them are bloodied, but the Ents need to be a bit careful, but if they can get into the right kind of units, I mean, especially when you see over here, there's a bunch of Orc archers which are just completely on their own. Orc archers would be absolutely devastated by Ents. A few arrows being loosed into the Dragon's Wrath warlords, charging into the Ents, will result in several of them being felled. The Dunedain Mounted Company will get in the way, however. Only 3 of them left, but it will interrupt the charge. Starting to see the beginnings of this engagement, perhaps, with arrow fire now being traded back and forth. Orc archers on one side, Arthedain marksmen on the other. 10 Dunedain Mounted Company moving forward. Dragon's Wrath warlords actually breaking as a result of that. The Mounted Company in melee, and then the proximity to the enemy army and how far away their support was enough to break the spirit of the warlords, although they will return, I'm sure. Yes, they do. Proportionally, small cavalry units are always likely to return more so than infantry and archers. Are we going to see a bit of a movement? I mean, there's no real need, I think, for Rhun to be posting up on a hill quite like that. There's still a little bit of jostling for position, so I can only assume, I mean, having a look at what is remaining for the attackers, I do think Winged Swordsman was able to make them pay a little bit more so than the attackers could really afford based on all that is left for the defenders here. I think Mordor and Rhun, the onus, even if they're the defenders, they are in the ascendancy, so I do think that they should, in a sporting manner, be willing to be the ones to take the fight to Mirkwood and Arthedain, and I think that's what's going to be happening. I mean, particularly with how strong Rhun still are. They're going to take losses by doing so, of course, but that is only going to make for a more interesting finale. The Elders of the Elven King still alive. I mean, it's not really the easiest defensive position to hold either, just because of how wide it is. That means that the superior numbers of the defenders at this point will really be coming into their own. A few more volleys. Arthedain marksman, but again, not the most damaging archer. They still had a unit of rangers, perhaps. We're very much coming into the home straight of Rangers being what they are in this current version of the game, so it's not the sort of thing that a team can rely upon to get them out of jail free, basically. Decent hits this, though. Some of the Mirkwood archers will also be getting involved with this. Plenty of hits, decent crossfire. And again, they are peeling out wide here, which is, again, completely unsurprising. This fortification, while not being used in the intended manner, is in the way, partially, of the advance at least. So it will have to split the attackers' attention rather than just blanketing the entire front line. Did I just refer to them as the attackers? They are the defenders, but they are now moving into these front lines. The Elven archers, you can always tell when they're opening up on the enemy. They certainly make their presence known vocally on the field, don't they? Mordor taking hits on the approach, but nothing too devastating. I mean, they can't afford to just sort of sit here in full view of the enemy. Now that they've moved forward, haste is key. Pontsman's army acting in more of a support role perhaps for her two Mihais, whereas Rhun probably going to be the ones to move over here. Orc archers moving in. It's a very bizarre second stage to this fight, I have to say. This is going to end fast, I would assume, but I'm surprised at how standoffish the forces of Mordor and Rhun have been. They do have the advantage after all, and yet they seem to be very concerned and very careful about moving forwards. Forward come the Woodland Realm Patrol, the Orc fodder, even, you know, out of ammunition Elven archers. By those standards, the patrol are actually not amazing, but they're only up against Orc fodder, so they will be just fine. In come the Ents as well, so, I mean, routing is one thing, which you can certainly bring to bear against Mordor, especially unsupported fodder like this when they get clattered by the Ents. As the rest of the army also starts to move forward. I just don't think they've got enough infantry here, the forces of Mirkwood and Arthedain, to be able to put on a truly decent showing. Very few peacekeepers backed up by Arthedain marksmen, but again, only Orc archers, so only the dregs, really. The dregs of the defending host, which will allow them to pad out their kill counts rather nicely. But ultimately it's all part of the plan, I'm sure, for this army. And you can see now that having Evendim's spearmen need to be the next infantry to come in, but when healthy Gamperim are representing a large proportion of the enemy army, this is where Rhun should really come into their own, and I think it's what really does put this battle beyond the attackers at this point. The fact that Rhun are here in numbers still, with armour piercing being brought to bear against what is a largely Arthedain-led defence at this point. Most of the meat of this front line is Arthedainian. Their pikes will help mitigate this problem somewhat, but you can see here that there is routing going on. And again, it took a while for the hammer to fall, but now that it is doing so, you can see the fragilities in what was left of the attackers. They did well against winged swordsmen, reasonably well anyway. They may have let their palace guard perish without support, which is a shame, but one unit of palace guard I don't think would be enough to really tilt the balance of power the other way. Arthedain shadow bows firing across as Rhun start to move forward. Yeah, and this is the thing, I mean, they were able to, the army looked like it was sort of ready to meet an advance, but when you looked a little closer at it, it was full of very basic Arthedain units. Many of the Elven units that remained were skirmishers, which, while good in melee, you want to be trying to use them at range first and foremost. So it's not too surprising to see the systematic routing here of the front line. Mordor showcasing their strengths once more. Elders of the Elven King going to get into melee. Rhun's strength still here, and I mean, obviously you're going to see Dragon's Wrath crossbows trying to do their thing as well. Elders of the Elven King having to deal with Temple Guard and Flag Rim. Again, it's all going to come down to a matter of numbers here as to why this fight is inevitably going to go the way that it is. Rhun continuing their clean-up on the top here. Peacekeeper's doing quite well against the flag rim, as perhaps you would expect, and many of the halberdiers are actually being held at arm's length by the Arthedain pikemen. So in a microcosm here you can see how Arthedain can deal with a runic infantry force, but there's simply too many angles for them to have to try and deal with. In come the trolls as well. Trolls, of course, the ideal answer to these pikes that still stand. And those crossbows as well will only hasten the demise of these forces. Mordor don't have too much room. Well, I'll say that, they've got a fair amount. Bit of a snowballing effect here in the late game in favour of the forces of evil. Marching on the Black Gate, however, what do you expect? Routing what few units are returning from the smashing success on the front line. Here Peng running. Olag High still running around the backfield. The elves of the Elven King are even routing as well. That's how you know that the morale has truly gone south, when the very finest that Mirkwood have to offer start to flee from the field as well. And Mordor just going after the scraps at this point. Some blades of Emondwyr have returned from routing, though surely not for too much longer. They would trade quite well with basic orcs, maybe not so much against Minas Morgul Chosen. Pontaman trying to get a few more kills before the battle is done. Arthedain's force up on this hill swept asunder by Rhun. Wards of the North, 33 of them remain, so they will almost certainly be the last unit left standing for the forces of good. Camel's Shadow Guard over here as well, with Temple Executioners. The Blades of Emondwyr will be dealt with. The Hiriek surely not too far behind. Minas Morgul Chosen just hanging out. 18 of them there. Arthedain Man at Arms. Actually, well, I mean, they're only going against all javelins, so maybe it's not a surprise that actually they're somehow still alive at the site of the original front line. Will they actually outlast the Wardens of the North? That would be pretty wild. They may do. There's only 16 Wardens left and they're wavering, considering the huge pressure they're under. Trolls, Black Numenorians, heavy Easterling spears. And then they do rout, so Arthedain Man-at-Arms will be the final unit left, although they just routed. So what is the final unit then? Something still lives? Something still fights? Is it the Hiriek? No. Well, what is still alive? It doesn't really matter, of course, in the grand scheme of things, but... Oh, it's Hiri Peng over here, okay. A unit of heavy elven archers who will almost certainly rout in the face of the Olag High pretty damn quickly. And there we go. There we have it. A victory for the defenders. Momentum was certainly on their side in the last engagement, which is why I'm surprised the defenders even took up a defensive position over there. Pretty fraudulent tactics, but in the end they did the right thing and advanced forward. It was really they did deserve the win, certainly the defenders, but it was really by the book. Like, none of them did anything wrong. They all did what they were supposed to, basically. A lot of the changes you would have to make would be for the attackers, and it begins, I think, with compositions. It's no surprise, I think, to my mind, that the two that decided to bring decent-sized armies, not only were they 2v1, but they also ended up outlasting their allies by quite a lot. I think that Lorien, you could maybe get away with an army that small if you weren't the ones being isolated 2v1. Half of Mirkwood maybe could have gone across to help them right from the off, instead of trying to crush winged swordsmen in quite so comprehensive a manner. That would have helped Lorien an awful lot. Especially Imladris, though, that small army really didn't help them, and the cavalry was always going to be an issue. Like the Norrotino cavalry, we didn't really see them in action, but they surely would have been melted by Melkor's Chosen very, very quickly, and surrendering the cav advantage when you have an army that small is a very dangerous thing to do, as Fried Rice did end up learning in this battle, I'm sure. When it comes to actually playing, like I said, I think Mirkwood could have sent over at least a portion, like a third or so of their army to help Lorien initially, and that would have made a big difference. Other than that, Lorien and Imladris, based on the fact that they were outnumbered significantly in both situations, should have adopted a very defensive posture, I think. Even though they're technically the attackers, it's going to be too tempting a target for Mordor and Rhun to resist, as we saw from Pontaman and Her-Tu-Mihai in particular's aggression. But yeah, it is an interesting one. I do think it all starts with composition, but ultimately the defenders certainly played well enough to be very deserving of that victory. But an interesting fight. So let's see what did the damage for the three Mordor armies. Olag High, not too surprising. I mean, when the fight starts going in Mordor's favour and units start scrambling all over the place, the Olag High represent a really, really good unit for doing extra damage. Apparently we're in the Shire, which seems very odd. Shire looks very different. Uruk Captains, 106, that's not too bad, considering Pontaman was going up against a very small Imladris army after all, so large numbers for his army are going to be few and far between, but Temple Guard doing nicely. Unsurprisingly, his cavalry was certainly the best aspect of the army. Melkor's Chosen and Arthedain Lancers doing very good work against the Imladris infantry. Only one unit breaking 100 kills for Her-Tu-Mihai, which again, Lorien were a small army and he did have Rhun's support as well, so not surprising that 0 on those all javelins, but 155 on the Olag High, so once again the Trolls actually proving themselves to be the MVPs maybe for the Mordor armies at the very least, as well as the Melkor's Chosen, I would say. And Winged Swordsman 2v1, so a few more units breaking 100 kills here just because of the pressure his army was under, but he was also killed fairly comprehensively, I would say, by Mirkwood and Arthedain in the end. They did a pretty good job at dealing with that force. But Nazgul, Temple Executioners, Olag High, back against the wall. The elite units are always going to be able to withstand that kind of treatment better than like basic units like the Morannon Infantry, for example. Temple Guard with less, but then they're also going to have less time to be able to shoot their armour-piercing arrows. So there we have it. Been a while since we've seen the Black Gate. It's a very... well, it's more really a pitch battle than a siege battle, but there was definitely an attack-defence kind of dynamic going on in this battle. It's been a while since we've seen this map as well. Very thematic, of course. So yeah, big thank you to Winged Swordsman for sending this one in. Another one that's not one of these behemoth long siege battles. I believe this one will be coming out just past the halfway point in November, if I'm not mistaken. Now, it is worth mentioning that I have learnt within the past, well, this is the first recording that I'm doing of this session, and I have learnt since the last one that I will probably be going away at the end of October, beginning of November for work again. Hopefully, for the last time, this will be an issue, and I have already got everything recorded, so that the schedule won't be impacted at all, and I will still actually have a little bit of breathing room even after I get back, so there isn't going to be any problems in that regard. But yeah, I won't be able to respond to comments as quickly. I won't be able to let people know that I've downloaded the replays that they've sent me, and I'll get to them as soon as I can. That'll have to wait until I get back. A lot's up in the air. I don't know how long I'll actually be going away for. It could be the full 3 weeks, or we could be done within 1 week. So it's one of those things where it is worth mentioning. It will have already happened by the time this battle comes out, but if anyone was wondering why I wasn't quite as present for the past few weeks, that will have been why. And like I already said, I hope that it will be the last time that I do end up going away in such a way. And the subject, and that is one of the subjects that I will be talking about in the intended live stream channel update that I will be doing. Like I've said, I do intend for that to be towards the end of this month, the end of November, or the very beginning of December. That's when I want to be doing it, and it will be taking the slot of what would be a normal video, I think. We may twin it with a quick look at maybe some of the stuff from the test build of Reforged. Maybe we'll just go through the rosters for any of the new factions that have been fully implemented. At the moment, I believe that's only the Rovanian, but even if that's still the case, we can have a little closer look at the stats and the numbers on that as well, just so we can twin it with something that's actually to do with the content that my channel's all about, rather than just an update about what's going to be happening in the future. But it may have to wait until December, a little bit further into December, because if I do end up moving out, which I hope to be able to do before the 6th of December, it's going to be difficult to squeeze in a live stream there, because I'm going to need to sort of hire a van and get all my stuff moved to the location that I'll be moving to next. But again, this is the sort of rambling I can save for the live stream. That's what its entire purpose is for. But yeah, that will be taking the place of one of the usual scheduled battle replay. So either the Wednesday or the Saturday, more likely the Saturday slot to be fair, because it'll be a little bit easier for me to do a live stream at the weekend rather than during a weekday, especially if it does end up being my last week at work. But yeah, anyway, enough of my rambling, enough nonsense. Big thank you to Winged Swordsman44 for sending this battle replay in and for being a big supporter of the channel, to be fair, over the course of the past year, really. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.